I'm Sai, and welcome to part one of the Age of Ecosystems mini masterclass on LinkedIn Live. A little bit about me before we dive in too deeply. I focus on transformation and change. I really partner with organizations, likewise help them calibrate their business models, their operating models for impact. As I like to say, I like to focus on the sacred triad, what I call the sacred triad, really how people and organizations deal with reality, human nature, and identity, who they are, fundamentally through integration of those aspects, through their awareness to achieve impact in the world. Got my contact information. Please don't hesitate to reach out as the conversation continues. Additionally, my experience is rooted in over 40 years of practice. And as I like to say, that practice has driven everything I've learned and likewise has really helped me understand and back that practice by theory. So very much rooted in practice and likewise backed by theory. Additionally, I'll make many references to two particular books. One is Conscious Agility, that was written in 2013 with two colleagues, and also the Anti-Fragility Edge. So a lot of the concepts, a lot of the things that we'll be talking about have their roots in those books and even before. So with that said, let's go ahead and dive right in. If we think about the unprecedented crises of 2020 and 2021, really those crises forced us to challenge, if you will, our modern life and how we existed at that point in time. It triggered fundamentally a societal renaissance that really began to shift our worldview from a more traditional viewpoint to an alternative viewpoint, where we were forced essentially to reconceptualize our whole reality. Two fundamental questions emerged. Really, how do we harness that turbulence, which is now more common than ever? And likewise, how do we flourish in a world where we can only expect the unexpected? As I like to say, the paradoxical and the age of entanglement. With that being said, the intent of this mini masterclass, not a full-blown masterclass by no stretch, is really exploratory exposure to what, why, and how of ecosystems. Very much rooted in pragmatism. And at the same time, what we'll do is we'll focus on insightful perspectives, actionable guidance towards impactful outcomes, very explicitly. As you consider those aspects, if you will, of this session and the next sessions that we have coming up, what we'll really do is we'll tap into ecosystem thinking and how to use ecosystem thinking to cultivate ecosystems and ecosystem enterprises. You can think about ecosystems as really collections of stakeholders and their environment and the dynamics between them. And really think about ecosystem enterprises as ecosystems of individuals and collectives internally within a broader external ecosystem. Key thing to emphasize as we dive in is that this is more than talking about technology platforms and business networks, much more than that. Leveraging the whole notion of ecosystem thinking, as we'll be discussing it, it really will help catalyze agility, resilience, and anti-fragility. Much more information, much more conversation to come around those key concepts. Before we dive in, this is a general outline of the conversations that are forthcoming. Again, very much a mini session of the full-blown version. But we'll talk about crises today. We'll dive into agility, resilience, and anti-fragility, ecosystem thinking, then go ahead and talk about ecosystems and ecosystem enterprises, and then transcending into an ecosystem enterprise. Things that I would encourage, whether you're listening or participating in real time in this session, things that I would encourage us to keep in mind. This is very much an invitation to partner. I'm not seeking agreement or disagreement. Everything I'm sharing is pretty much demonstrated in practice and continues to grow and change as I learn and as practitioners learn. So very much really seeking to explore together. At the same time, this is not everything. So this is merely exposure, again, derived from practice, has proven to be successful. Some of the things I'll say may sound and be unconventional, counterintuitive, and unorthodox, and at the same time challenge our sensibilities and may sound completely heretical to the things that you've experienced or you learned in your own practice. Furthermore, What I also encourage us to keep in mind is you truly will get out of this session, amongst other sessions, what you put into them. So I encourage you to first be curious, then really be creative, rather than project perhaps our own thinking into a situation. At the same time, apply critical thinking to the conversation and really be a critical thinker. Furthermore, really be a deliberate practitioner, very much so applying deliberate practice. Taking some of the ideas, thinking about them, and I'll make a lot of suggestions about how to implement some of the things that I'll be talking about. Additionally, really focus on solving problems, experimenting, and zooming in, zooming out of the different things that we'll be talking about, different levels of abstraction. With all that being said, let's go ahead and dive right in to the first key session here. So the thing that I would like to talk about is really the age, if you will, in the age of ecosystems, is the anatomy of crises. And in this first session, the intent is really to go ahead and explore crises a little bit, identify some of the key concepts. I'm going to hone in on two particular questions. How do we work with crises is a very fundamental question. And then additionally, how do we become more crisis ready? Notice I say more crisis ready, not simply crisis proof, but rather more crisis ready. Those are really the two key questions that we want to hone in on. So with that said, let's go ahead and share a little bit of sort of various stories and aspects of various stories based on the crises that unfolded in 2020 and 2021. As the crises began to unfold, I started to receive a lot of communications, a lot of current clients, former clients, etc., really began to reach out. And the overall sentiment was, Sai, we can't make sense of anything. We don't know what to do. We can't make any decisions. At the same time, we're just locking up. People don't know what to do. Our organization doesn't know what to do. We have challenges with our customers, with our partners, if you will. We don't know where the marketplace is going. We're completely at a loss. What we thought our business models were robust and wholesome and that would generate profit and growth for us, we're in a survival mode at this point. Our operating models, we're not even sure that they're going to provide the integrity necessary for us to stay as a business. So there was a bit of panic in all the outreach. And in a lot of those conversations, people really didn't know what to do, completely didn't know what to do. I had everyone from the C-suite, CEOs, CFOs, and COOs reaching out to folks in the trenches, in the everyday, if you will, of HR, operational support, marketing, sales, parties delivering services and products. So you name it, there was a lot of, if you will, unknown in the world at that point in time. But everyone reaching out saying, can't make sense of anything, can't make decisions, can't do anything. Now what? Became the real question. Saying all that, I immediately suggested that some of the groups I was working with really just get their leaders into a conversation, and immediately grabbed a number of leaders within organizations, brought them into a conversation. I said, okay, let's just go ahead and wrap our heads around, what are we experiencing? What's going on? As they began to talk and they began to share what they were experiencing, some would mention things like, well, we don't know what's going to happen to our employees. Some of them are locking up and being able to work remote, and some of them seem to be able to work remote. We can at the same time lean on some employees and likewise are very suspicious of where other employees are in terms of their ability to contribute. Same thing began to happen relative to partners. They would say things like, well, we've got partners A, B, and C who've already reached out, said they're willing to work with us and support us and are looking for our support. And at the same time, we've got partners that are just literally disappearing from the radar. And the same thing began to be expressed around customers as well. We're uncertain of our customers. Some groups were saying to me, the complexity of the solutions that we provide, we have no idea now how to provide those solutions in a remote environment because we can no longer be in person. So many of the elements of the conversation and the experience were really honed in on what's volatile in the world that we're experiencing, what's perhaps uncertain, what's complex, and what's ambiguous. Additionally, I began to ask questions. Well, okay, if that's volatile and you can't gauge where you are relative to it, or it becomes unpredictable for you, what other things are stable? Well, we've got employee and team member X, who seems to be a stable, concrete person that we can go to. And likewise, we've got pillar customers that we can lean on. At the same time, If we know that we can't achieve our business objectives or quarterly goals or what have you, and there's a lack of clarity how to even make progress toward those elements, what things can we be clear about? Well, we can be very clear in that we can reach out to our team members and immediately give feedback or give direction. So elements of clarity. So in all of that, it really was helping the groups that I was having conversations with just anchor themselves in a common place. That was really it in that conversation. At the same time, the conversations shifted to, well, based on what we're now experiencing, fundamentally, what strengths do we have? Well, we have a strong HR department that's very well connected with our employee base. We have a very strong marketing department, perhaps that's very much listening to the market, even though the market is very erratic at this point. At the same time, we may say, well, we have a very weak sales arms. The communication of outreach to prospects and potential customers and clients is very weak to close business. So we can begin to identify weaknesses at the same time. I would ask questions around, well, okay, what opportunities do you see? And many saw no opportunities, but rather just merely the threat of survival at that point. So as the conversation continued, not only were the different groups really anchoring together around sort of their perspective relative to VUCA, but also beginning to anchor around their common understanding of their strengths and weaknesses, and likewise opportunities and threats. As the conversation then continued, then we began to really say, okay, well, how do we now go ahead and move that understanding toward doing something? What's next? What do we do now? So through that orientation, if you will, around VUCA and strengths and weaknesses and opportunities and threats, we said, okay, what immediate decisions need to be made relative to our partners, relative to our employees, relative to our customers? Perhaps we need to reach out to every customer and just let them know that we're here. Excellent. That's a decision that we can make. And now let's go ahead and enact it. Very, very much so. At the same time, we can ask ourselves, what can we wait and do this next week, or do we need to do it now? There's an immediacy of action that became relevant. And really what we began to exercise in that portion of the conversation is, now that we're orienting ourselves around our common experience of the world, talking about VUCA, talking about essentially our strengths and weaknesses, opportunities and threats, what immediate decisions have to be made, what decisions can be delayed a bit, and likewise, what action need to be taken. Very key in terms of now moving us forward. So as I did this with different groups in about 1 hour time segments, essentially now the group began to form a discipline where we would use VUCA to form a common perspective. We would go ahead and likewise think about our strengths and weaknesses, opportunities and threats, more immediate, again, expand that perspective, then go ahead and make decisions and take actions, maintain a degree of observation relative to those actions we're taking, and then that would help orient us, essentially John Boyd's OODA. As I describe it, keep in mind that the whole OODA concept wasn't linear. It might have felt linear when we started, but truly we're observing, orienting, deciding, and acting in complete overlap. And as I did that with various groups, we began to expand across the organization so that others could begin to navigate the world in which we found ourselves. And as we began to navigate, we would do this every day initially. Then what began to happen is, as we reached elements of perhaps stability, clarity, and not only stability and clarity, some degree of certainty, and some degree of understanding versus mere complexity, we began to perhaps do these conversations every other day and be able to navigate the world around us. Now, given all of that, a few things I want to definitely call out before we begin to summarize sort of the overall patterns that we're seeing. It was very key as to who was participating in these conversations. It wasn't just everybody. It was very key to keep the group of participants focused and moving forward. The conversations themselves were very time-boxed, very disciplined in terms of what we needed to do in every conversation so that we can enact the decisions we were making. Additionally, even though I talk about VUCA first, and then I talk about strengths and weaknesses, opportunities and threats, and then OODA, these elements really overlapped. They were emergent in any order in the time box in which we were having the conversations. So a lot of energy. And as we built that muscle and discipline, it began to give each group its own set of structures to work with. Furthermore, with many of these groups, we started to do this every day initially. And then as things became a little bit more sane, perhaps, and they shifted back to insanity and a bit of sanity along the journey, we would do them more often where there was more chaos, less often, if you will, where there's less chaos. So the window and the time that was needed was very much key as to how we responded to the environment around us. Additionally, it was conversations that were expansive. As they occurred with one group, this rippled into other groups, and then the other groups, and every group began to influence its, if you will, decision processes, actions. And really what began to happen is organizations, as I worked with them, began to shift into more ecosystem organizations versus more traditional organizations. Saying all of that, a lot of these concepts I've been applying for years, but they became that much more relevant in the context in which we found ourselves in 2020. Other things that the groups really recognized, that they were not simply looking at the world as black and white, but truly gray. On two extremes, there was order and disorder, and they were operating in between. They had to work with the stresses that were beneficial, eustress, and stresses that were perhaps not beneficial to them, causing them de-stress. But the core questions that we began to answer in all of those experiences is, what is the nature of reality? What is our nature? How do we experience that reality? And fundamentally are able at that point then to act in the world. Saying all of that, let's go ahead now and really summarize some of these patterns and concepts as I mentioned. From those stories, as you can readily see, we focused on these sort of four pillars: what's volatile around us, what's uncertain, what's complex, what's ambiguous. It isn't so much what's the answer to these questions or what's the meaning of these words. It's giving us a common perspective as a group relative to the world around us. That was the key. It was time boxed also so we didn't fester. That was extremely crucial, as I mentioned. But truly, what is the nature of reality was the question that we were trying to understand to some degree here so that we can all have a common viewpoint relative to the world around us. Relative to the next question, what is our nature? What are our strengths? What are our weaknesses? What are our opportunities? What are our threats? And again, it wasn't so much about quantifying or qualifying these elements, but it truly is having a shared understanding and a shared binding, if you will, understanding of our nature. So the first question was, what is the nature of reality? The second question here in this case is, what is our nature? Additionally, as the conversation, as I mentioned, naturally moved toward, okay, given that understanding, we have a little bit of orientation. What's our intention? Our intentions in the situations that we found ourselves was truly survival. Perfect. Now we have a sense of orientation. So now what are the decisions that have to be made? Again, given time, by thinking about what are the decisions we have to make, that began to identify options. And then whatever decision we made, that really became an experiment to enact that decision, understand what the outcomes are, again, that we observed, feedback into the orientation and continue that cycle. As I mentioned before, that cycle is not linear. So we were orienting, deciding, acting, and observing very much simultaneously as we got out of the gate and continued. The cadence, as I mentioned, was also very relevant. Doing this every day based on the degree of chaos surrounding us. And then likewise, as we had less chaos, perhaps we can go ahead and do this every other day, etc. All those facets that came into play really were addressing the questions that clients and customers had reached out with. We can't make sense of the world. We can't make decisions, and we don't know what actions to take. But this began to give them an operating model very much that allowed them to navigate that reality. As I mentioned again, this is not about, if you will, just operating in a world where there's order and disorder, but rather it's recognizing the reality of one extreme order, other extreme complete disorder, and then operating in the in-between. Additionally, operating in the in-between, the stresses that benefit us, eustress, and the stresses that don't benefit us, de-stress. That really began to summarize, this picture begins to summarize the experiences. Again, I've applied this before, if you will, the 2020 experience, but very much so the relevance of this became that much more crucial. One other thing to really summarize relative to all this is when folks reached out, really this was the sentiments that they were communicating. Past is incoherent and complex. We can't make sense of it given the now. The present very volatile and ambiguous, and the future looks unpredictable and uncertain. Fundamentally, that was the sentiment. At the same time, from their perspective, they could be completely averse to the reality that was confronting them. They can be completely careless and inclined to take action, perhaps without being completely aware of what the potential ramifications were. But more than anything else, the key was to really helping individuals and groups become aware and savvy as to the reality in which they were operating. Saying all that, if you really reflect on everything I've shared, there's a natural sense of fear that was being experienced. And perhaps people's immediate reaction was to try to control that fear and control the reality that was causing that fear, perhaps even remove the fear. But that's a very reactive mode to the world around us. What I encouraged folks to do in applying these concepts is to acknowledge the reality and likewise engage and work with that reality. The acknowledgement of reality is recognizing that there are two extremes, order and disorder. Engaging in the in-between is the key. As time passed and I reflected with clients relative to the experience that they went through, they truly felt like and were able to verbalize that they were liberated from this vicious fear control cycle and truly embraced a virtuous reality identity cycle. And that reality identity cycle is fundamentally working with the reality, acknowledging it and working with it, and likewise who they are and what they want to accomplish. These are the elements essentially that we'll be diving into, but this is truly the anatomy of crises. So back to the questions that I posed in the beginning. How do we work with crises? These are the fundamental concepts, all the way from VUCA to strengths and weaknesses, opportunities and threats, and UDA. These are the elements of an operating model that fundamentally allows us to deal with crises. And likewise, everything in between that isn't necessarily a crisis, but truly operate on different heartbeats in different time frames and build our muscle to do that. Next question I had posed is, how do we become more crisis ready? Well, here's my suggestion. Build your crisis ready muscle. Take some of these concepts. Create simulations for yourself individually or thought experiments. Take something that would happen around you and say, well, okay, now how would I deal with this? From a VUCA perspective, let me have the conversation with myself. From a strengths and weaknesses, opportunities and threats perspective, what would that look like? And how would I essentially now embrace that viewpoint? That gives you anchoring. And now at that point, think about what decisions and actions have to manifest, how that feeds into what you're observing relative to those actions, and then ultimately how that would help you reorient yourself as you progress. Again, these overlap, not as linear. All of this meshes together. But as a simulation, try it individually. Additionally, this is what I do with clients, and likewise, individuals and collectives. I work with teams where we simulate crises, give the group a crisis, essentially in a workshop fashion, understand how we would deal with that crisis from these different elements, and likewise be able to enact these things. Not only is a workshop or a simulation that you can do, but also go ahead and actually simulate a real crisis in your environment, and then let the organization or let the groups and the individuals really exercise and build that crisis ready muscle. At the end of the day, how do we work with crises? These are the elements. These are the elements that will perpetuate as we continue the conversation in one form or another. How do we become more crisis ready? Build your crisis ready muscle. Simulation is a great tool, individually, groups, and full enterprises, whether they're in workshops or they're in broader exercises. Very key tools to use, but fundamentally, those are some of the immediate practical things that you can make use of. With all that being said, this really covers a significant portion of our first session. At this point, looking forward to part 2. Again, I'm Sai, and thank you for joining part 1 of the Age of Ecosystems mini masterclass. Thank you.